She was turned into a monster for being a victim. Let that actually land for a second, because we have all heard the name Medusa, snake hair, stone gaze, the creature that turned anyone who looked at her directly into cold, grey rock, the ultimate villain of Greek mythology, something so terrifying that warriors put her face on their shields to frighten enemies in battle, a monster so fearsome that even her severed head, detached from her body and dripping blood, was used as a weapon for decades after she died. That is the story you grew up with. That is the story that has been told and retold for 3,000 years, in paintings and poems and films and video games. Monster, villain, creature, threat. But here is what almost none of those retellings ever tell you. Medusa did not start out as a monster. She was born human, and not just human. She was a priestess. A woman who had devoted her entire life to serving one of the most powerful and revered goddesses in the ancient world. She lived by strict vows. She followed every rule. She was dedicated, loyal, and by every account we have, beautiful. Genuinely, famously beautiful. In a world where that kind of beauty was considered a divine gift. And then, one day, a god walked into the temple where she served. He did what he wanted, and when he left, the goddess that Medusa had served her entire life did not punish him. She punished Medusa, stripped her of everything, transformed her into the monster you know, exiled her to the edge of the world to live out the rest of her mortal life in isolation, surrounded by the stone statues of everyone who had ever accidentally looked at her face. And then, after all of that, made sure the version of events that survived the next 3,000 years cast Medusa as the villain in her own story. This is not a mythology video. This is an institutional story about what happens when the most powerful figure in the room decides that protecting the predator is more politically convenient than protecting the victim. About how that decision gets dressed up in the language of justice, and about how, once the cover story is in place, it takes 2,000 years for anyone to seriously question it. Buckle up. Because once you see this story clearly, it is almost impossible to look away. To understand what was taken from Medusa, you first need to understand what she was before any of this happened, because the monster version of her story has been so dominant for so long that it has almost completely erased the person she actually was. Most people, if you ask them to picture Medusa, see the creature, snakes writhing out of her scalp, eyes that kill, a face that belongs in a nightmare. That image is so deeply embedded in Western culture that it feels ancient and inevitable, like it was always this way, but it was not always this way. Medusa was one of 3 sisters, known collectively as the Gorgons. Her sisters were named Athena and Euryale, and this is the first detail that almost every popular retelling drops, but it is crucial to the story. Both of her sisters were immortal. They could not be killed. They were permanent, eternal creatures who existed outside the reach of death. Medusa was the only mortal Gorgon. Think about what that means. It means that from the very beginning, Medusa existed in a state of fundamental vulnerability that her sisters did not share. They could not die. She could. She could be hurt, wounded, and eventually destroyed in a way that Athena and Euryale simply could not. Her mortality was not a minor biographical detail. It was the foundational fact of her existence. And it is directly why Perseus was sent after her specifically, centuries later. You could not kill an immortal Gorgon. You could kill Medusa. She was mortal, which made her the target. Now, the actual description of what Medusa looked like before the transformation is something you have to go to specific ancient sources to find, because later traditions buried it almost completely. But it is there. The Roman poet Ovid, writing in the Metamorphoses around the year 8 AD, is the most detailed surviving source about Medusa's life before she became the creature of mythology. And Ovid is not ambiguous about this. He describes Medusa as famous for her beauty. He writes that she was desired by many men. He specifically describes her hair as her most celebrated feature, the quality that made her remarkable, even among remarkable women. This is not a minor flourish. Ovid's account is the most complete narrative of what happened to Medusa, and he begins it by establishing clearly that she was not a monster. She was a person a beautiful, mortal, real person, and she was a priestess in the temple of Athena. Now this is where the context becomes essential, because in the ancient Greek world, a priestess was not just a religious figure in the way that term might register today. It was one of the few positions of genuine institutional status and social power available to women. A priestess was bound by formal vows. She was a servant of a specific deity, living according to that deity's codes and rules. The temple she served in was considered sacred ground, inviolable, protected by divine authority, untouchable by the ordinary chaos of the human world. For a temple of Athena, this was especially significant. Athena was one of the 3 virgin goddesses of Olympus. She had taken a vow of chastity. The temple of Athena was not just a religious building. It was a physical extension of Athena's own identity, her purity, her wisdom, her authority. The women who served in that temple were held to the same standards. They kept the same vows. They were under the same protection. Medusa was not just a random woman who ended up in the wrong place. She was an institutional servant. She had chosen a life of devotion. She was operating entirely within the rules of the system she had been given, and the system failed her in the most total way imaginable. But before we get to what happened in that temple, you need to understand something about the power structure Medusa was operating inside. Because Athena's response to what Poseidon did cannot be understood without understanding the political reality she was navigating. And once you see that political reality clearly, her decision becomes even more disturbing than it first appears. The Greek gods were not equals. This is one of the most important things to understand about the Greek pantheon, and it is also one of the most consistently misrepresented things. Popular culture tends to present the Olympians as a kind of divine committee, 12 powerful beings who argued and competed, but ultimately operated on roughly similar levels. That is not accurate. The Greek pantheon was a strict hierarchy, with real power differentials and very specific rules about who could challenge whom. At the top was Zeus, god of the sky, king of the gods, father figure, and supreme authority of the Olympian order. Below him were the other major Olympians, but not all of them were equal. Some held vastly more power than others. And at the very top tier, just below Zeus himself, sat the 3 brothers who had divided the cosmos between them. Zeus ruled the sky and all of Olympus. Hades ruled the underworld, and Poseidon ruled the sea. Now, in the ancient world, the sea was not a distant backdrop. It was everything. It was trade. It was war. It was survival and death. The Mediterranean world was built around maritime power. Every city-state that mattered was connected to the sea. Every major conflict involved the sea. Whoever controlled the waters controlled the world. Poseidon's domain was not a side territory. It was foundational. His power was almost without limit. He could cause earthquakes with a blow of his trident. He could drown fleets, raise storms, destroy coastlines. He was called the Earth Shaker. The civilizations of the ancient world feared him in the way that people today fear natural disasters, because he essentially was a natural disaster, personified and conscious and capable of decision, and he answered to nobody except, in nominal terms, Zeus. Now, here is the political context that makes everything that follows make sense. Poseidon and Athena have a history. There is a famous myth, separate from the Medusa story, about a contest between Poseidon and Athena for the patronage of the city that would become Athens, the most important city in the ancient Greek world, the cultural center of civilization as the Greeks understood it. Both deities wanted control. Both presented gifts to the city. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident and produced a spring of water. Athena struck the ground with her spear and caused an olive tree to grow. The Athenians chose the olive tree. They chose Athena. Poseidon lost. He was furious. He flooded the countryside in retaliation. This is the backdrop. There was already rivalry, already tension, already a specific history of competition between these two gods, in which Athena had come out on top and Poseidon had not forgotten it. And then Poseidon walked into Athena's temple. What happened there, the precise nature of the encounter between Poseidon and Medusa, has been translated and interpreted in different ways across different ancient sources. Ovid, the most complete account, describes it as assault. He describes it as a violation committed in a sacred space, against a woman who served that sacred space. The language he uses, and this has been analyzed by classical scholars at Columbia, at Yale, at Oxford, is not the language of consensual encounter. It is the language of force. Other ancient sources, particularly earlier Greek ones, are more euphemistic. Some describe a union. Some soften the language into something that sounds more like seduction. But here is what you need to understand about how ancient Greek texts discussed sexual encounters involving gods and mortal women. The power differential between a god and a mortal woman was so extreme, so total, so absolute, that the ancient writers consistently soften their language when describing what gods did to mortals, not because they thought it was acceptable, but because calling it what it was would have implied that a mortal woman could resist a god, which would have implied a kind of agency and power that the system was not prepared to grant her. The language was sanitized because the alternative was too destabilizing to the existing power structure. When Zeus wanted a woman, Europa, Leda, Danae, Callisto, Io, dozens of others, the texts did not typically say he forced her. They said he was taken with her, he visited her, he came to her. The vocabulary of desire replaced the vocabulary of violence, even when the power differential made meaningful consent essentially impossible. Modern classical scholars reading these texts through that lens consistently arrive at the same conclusion about Medusa. What happened in that temple was not something she chose, and when Athena found out, this is the moment the story becomes something darker than mythology, because Athena did not go to Poseidon, she went to Medusa. And this is where you have to sit with the complexity of what Athena actually faced, because understanding her impossible position, the political reality she was navigating, does not excuse what she did, but it does explain it. And the explanation is, in some ways, more disturbing than simple cruelty would have been. Let us be exact about what Athena could and could not do. Poseidon was Zeus's brother, one of the three cosmic rulers. He had sovereign authority over an entire domain of existence. You did not bring charges against Poseidon. There was no mechanism for that. The hierarchy of Olympus did not include a formal accountability structure for crimes committed by the most powerful gods against mortal women. Could Athena have gone to Zeus? Technically, as his favorite daughter, she had access to him that other gods did not. She could have made the case. But think about who Zeus was. Io, Europa, Leda, Danae, Callisto. The list of women Zeus had imposed himself upon, by deception, by force, by transformation into animals to prevent resistance, was extensive and well documented across ancient Greek literature. Going to Zeus to complain about what Poseidon did to a woman in a temple would have been, in the political logic of Olympus, almost farcical. You were appealing to the most powerful institution in the world, which was run by someone who had done the same thing, against a lesser institution's member. The outcome of that appeal was predictable. Athena knew this. She was the goddess of wisdom. Strategic intelligence was her defining characteristic. She understood the power structure she existed within better than almost anyone. She could not touch Poseidon. To challenge him directly, to attempt any form of meaningful accountability, would have meant challenging the foundational hierarchy of Olympus. It would have meant going to war with a cosmic power over the treatment of a mortal woman in a way that the entire structure of divine authority was designed to prevent. It was a battle she could not win, and she knew it. So she did what institutions do when they cannot or will not hold the powerful accountable. She managed the situation in the direction of the least powerful person involved. She turned on Medusa. Ovid describes the transformation in some of the most haunting language in ancient literature. Athena reached down and changed Medusa's famous hair into a mass of writhing snakes. She altered her face into something so terrible that anyone who looked at it directly would turn immediately to stone. She took the woman's most celebrated beauty, the hair that had made her remarkable, the face that had made men want to be near her, and transformed them into weapons. Not weapons she controlled, weapons she was. The curse was not that Medusa could petrify people. The curse was that she could not stop doing it. She could not turn it off. She could not interact with any other living being without destroying them simply by existing. The punishment was not proportionate. It was not symbolic. It was not temporary. It was total, permanent, and specifically designed to ensure that Medusa could never again function as a person in the world. She was driven out of civilization entirely. She fled, or was driven. It is hard to know which, because the myth does not tell you her interior experience, only what happened to her. To the very edges of the known world, to a remote location near the land of the Hesperides, beyond the far Western Ocean, at the margins of where the ancient Greeks imagined the world ending. A cave. Isolation. Her two immortal sisters beside her, the only beings in existence who could safely look at her, and around her, stone. Everywhere she looked, stone. The frozen figures of men who had wandered too close, or stumbled upon her, or simply looked at her face by accident, turned to rock, permanent, unrescuable. Not because Medusa had chosen to harm them, because she had been made into something that could not help it. She was lethal by nature now, not by choice. Athena had made certain of that. And here is where the story takes its most overlooked turn. Because most people think this is the end of Medusa's story, until Perseus shows up. But what happens when Perseus does arrive, and what emerges from Medusa's body the moment she dies, is one of the most significant details in all of Greek mythology. And it has been almost entirely ignored in popular retellings for a reason. Perseus was the son of Zeus. This is an important detail, and it is worth examining for a moment, because the origins of Perseus mirror the origins of the problem in almost every significant way. His mother was Danae, a princess who had been locked in a bronze tower by her own father, Acrisius, because an oracle had warned him that a son born to Danae would eventually kill him. Acrisius's solution was to make access to his daughter impossible. He locked her away, guarded, isolated, sealed off from the world. Zeus visited her anyway. He came to her as a shower of gold. She was locked in a tower. She could not leave. There was nowhere to go. The texts describe what happened as a divine visit. Perseus was born 9 months later. Perseus, the man sent to kill Medusa, was himself the product of a divine encounter between an all-powerful god and a woman who had been specifically imprisoned to prevent encounters like this one. The pattern is not subtle. Perseus was eventually tasked by a king named Polydectes, who wanted him dead and out of the way, to retrieve the head of Medusa. This was considered a suicide mission. Nobody came back from Medusa's cave. The stone figures around her testified to that. But Perseus had divine assistance, from Athena herself, who gave him a polished shield he could use as a mirror to look at Medusa indirectly, and from Hermes, who provided winged sandals and a sword capable of decapitating her. He found Medusa sleeping. He used the shield. He took her head. And this is where most versions of the story cut away, because the next few moments are inconvenient. When Perseus decapitated Medusa, 2 beings burst from her body. The first was Chrysaor, a warrior, or in some versions a giant, who would go on to father the 3-headed monster Geryon, eventually one of Heracles' challenges. The second was Pegasus. Pegasus, the winged horse. One of the most beautiful, iconic, transcendent creatures in all of Greek mythology. A being of such grace and power that he would become the horse of the Muses, the divine figures responsible for all art, music, poetry, and inspiration. A creature so magnificent that Zeus himself eventually placed him among the stars as a constellation. You can see Pegasus in the sky on clear nights in the northern hemisphere every autumn. Pegasus was Medusa's son. Both children were Poseidon's. They had been growing inside Medusa while she lived in that cave. While she was in exile, while she was carrying the consequences of what had been done to her. While she was being used as the villain in a story she had never chosen to be part of. And they emerged into the world at the moment of her death. Sit with the symbolism of that for a moment. From a woman who had been declared monstrous, stripped of beauty, exiled from civilization, rendered lethal, hunted, came one of the most magnificent creatures ever to exist in Greek myth. From the woman who could not look at anything without destroying it, came a being that represented the very best of the mortal world's aspirations. Poetry, inspiration, flight. Pegasus was born from the intersection of Poseidon's violence and Medusa's suffering, and he did not belong to either of them. He flew away immediately. He went to Olympus. He became something transcendent. The ancient writers clearly knew what they were doing with this image. But the story does not pause to let you sit with it, because it has somewhere else to be. Perseus collects the head. He puts it in a bag. He flies away on the winged sandals. He has more adventures. He saves a princess named Andromeda. He defeats more monsters. He returns home. The head proves useful several more times, turning an entire Titan Atlas to stone when he refuses Perseus' hospitality, and later turning Polydectes and his court to stone when they threaten Perseus' mother. Medusa's story from this point forward is the story of her head, useful in death, weaponized in death. Her agency ended the moment Perseus entered her cave. Everything that follows is about what other people did with the parts of her that remained. And eventually, this is the detail that should close the loop on everything. Perseus gave the head to Athena, who mounted it on her breastplate. The Aegis, Athena's divine armor. She took the head of the woman she had condemned, the woman she had transformed and exiled and abandoned to centuries of isolation and eventual murder, and she wore it as a symbol of power and protection. Medusa's face, terrifying to behold, still useful as a deterrent, still doing its job, still keeping people at bay. Even in death, she was being used. So why did the ancient Greeks tell this story? Why did they take what is very clearly, in the oldest and most complete sources, a story about institutional injustice, and transmit it primarily as a monster tale? The answer involves deliberate choices about power, about narrative, and about whose version of history gets to survive into the next civilization. Here is something fundamental that most people never learn about Greek mythology. It was not a fixed, agreed-upon body of stories that everyone in the ancient world accepted as canonical. It was a living, constantly evolving tradition. Different city-states had different versions of the same myths. Different poets and playwrights had different takes. Different temples had institutional interests in how specific gods were portrayed. The mythology changed over time, was shaped by political circumstances, was used as a tool for propaganda, social control, and the justification of existing power structures. The version of a myth that survived into the modern world was almost always the version that served the interests of whoever had the most power during the period when that version solidified. Think about where the most important versions of the Greek myths were preserved. Athens, the most powerful city-state of the classical period, the cultural and intellectual center of the ancient Greek world, the city that produced Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides, Thucydides, the the city that built the Parthenon on the Acropolis and put it at the center of its civic identity. And the Parthenon was the temple of Athena. In Athens, Athena was not just one god among many. She was the patron deity of the city. The city's entire identity was organized around her. Athenian democracy, Athenian military power, Athenian cultural supremacy, all of it pointed back to Athena as divine sponsor and symbolic source. The story of how Athena won the contest against Poseidon for the city's patronage was told and retold as the origin myth of Athenian civilization. You did not tell stories in Athens that made Athena look bad. This is not speculative. It is simply how propaganda works in any society at any time. The stories that powerful institutions allow to circulate are the stories that serve those institutions. The stories that complicate the official narrative get simplified. The nuance gets stripped. The moral ambiguity gets resolved in favor of whoever is in charge. Now look at what the Medusa story required if Athena was going to remain above reproach. It required Medusa to be the villain, not a victim, not a complicated figure, a monster, a creature of chaos and death, something that threatened civilization and needed to be eliminated, something that Perseus, representing the heroic values of the Greek world, was right to destroy. Something that Athena was justified in creating, because she was not creating a monster. She was revealing one, punishing one. The version of the story that served Athens was the one that made Athena's decision look like divine justice, rather than institutional self-protection. And that is the version that survived, was transmitted, was taught, was painted, was sculpted, was repeated. But the version was not perfect, because Ovid's account, Roman, not Athenian, written in the 1st century AD, outside the direct sphere of Athenian cultural hegemony, preserved enough detail to complicate everything. Ovid described Medusa as beautiful before the transformation. He described what Poseidon did as a violation. He described Athena's response as a punishment directed at the wrong person. He preserved the ambiguity that the Athenian tradition wanted gone, and here is the additional layer that makes the whole thing even more striking. In the very oldest representations of Medusa in Greek art, predating the classical period by centuries, Medusa is not purely a monster. The Gorgonean, her face, her image, was used as a protective symbol. Ancient Greeks put Medusa's face on their shields, on the walls of their buildings, above doorways, on coins. The face that could turn people to stone was, in this older tradition, a protective force. You put her image up to ward off evil. Her gaze was power, deployed on behalf of the person displaying it. She was a guardian before she became a monster. The transformation of Medusa from protective symbol to creature of chaos tracks directly with the rise of Athenian classical culture and the consolidation of the myth into the hero and monster framework that served that culture's values. It was not gradual erosion, it was a deliberate narrative choice. The monstrous version of Medusa was useful. The complicated version, the priestess, the victim, the woman unjustly condemned, was not. So the complicated version was simplified, and then, for roughly 2,000 years, the simple version dominated. But here is where the story of Medusa's story becomes something close to remarkable. Because the image of Medusa did not just sit quietly in the mythology books once Western civilization moved into the Renaissance and beyond. It was actively deployed, repeatedly, across centuries. And the way it was used tells you something very specific about what each era needed it to mean. The history of how Medusa's image has been used over the past 2,000 years is one of the stranger threads in Western cultural history. In ancient Rome, the Gorgoneon, that terrifying face with its wide eyes and protruding tongue, appeared regularly on military and civic imagery. The Roman Emperor Augustus reportedly had a breastplate that depicted the Gorgon's head, carrying forward the tradition Athena had established. Roman buildings, coins, and mosaics use the image as a protective symbol. Even in Rome, the legacy was complicated and layered. Then, something shifted as the classical tradition moved into medieval Europe. In the Renaissance, Medusa became a subject of obsession. And the specific image that obsessed Renaissance artists was not the living Medusa, not the priestess, not the woman in the cave. It was the severed head. Caravaggio painted Medusa's head on a shield, a real shield, reportedly commissioned by Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte as a gift for the Grand Duke of Tuscany. The painting is striking. Medusa's face is frozen in the moment of realization, her own death catching up to her. Her expression is terror and anguish. The snakes on her head seem to be reacting to the shock. It is genuinely disturbing to look at, but the most politically charged deployment came in 1545, when Cosimo de' Medici commissioned Benvenuto Cellini to create a bronze sculpture for the Loggia dei Lanzi in Florence's Piazza della Signoria. The sculptor depicted Perseus standing triumphant, holding Medusa's severed head aloft, her body crumpled at his feet beneath him, her neck still dripping blood onto her own lifeless face below him. This sculpture was not just art. It was a political statement. Cosimo de' Medici had recently consolidated total control over Florence, ending the republic that had governed the city for generations. The choice of this specific subject, a hero standing triumphant over a destroyed, dangerous female power, was deliberate. It was the Medici saying, in visual language that every viewer understood. The chaos that threatened order has been defeated. Power is restored. The old, dangerous thing is dead. Medusa's story was being used to justify the end of a republic. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the image resurfaced again in political discourse. During the French Revolution, caricaturists used Medusa imagery in ways that connected female power to threat and chaos, the dangerous force that needed to be suppressed for civilization to function. In debates about women's suffrage in the 19th century, Medusa appeared in political cartoons as a symbol of what unchecked female influence could produce. In 1922, Sigmund Freud wrote a short essay called Medusa's Head, Das Medusa-Haupt, in which he argued that Medusa represented the castration anxiety of men confronted with female sexuality. The petrification that her gaze caused was, in Freud's reading, a symbol of the male terror of female bodily power. The severed head was its resolution. Freud's interpretation is contested, to put it mildly, but it spread widely and added a psychoanalytic layer to Medusa's image that carried enormous cultural influence through the 20th century. What is consistent across all of these deployments, Roman, Renaissance, Revolutionary, Victorian, psychoanalytic, is this. Medusa's story kept being used as a container for anxieties about female power. The monster being defeated was always, at some level, the terrifying possibility of femininity operating outside of male control. The hero with the sword was always the resolution. The original story, the woman, the temple, the god who walked in, the goddess who chose the wrong target, had been so thoroughly buried under centuries of political deployment that it barely registered. Until, fairly recently, it started to. Because something happened in the modern era, in academic scholarship first, and then in popular culture, in a wave that has arguably never been larger than it is right now, that began to reverse the burial. Scholars started going back to the original sources, and what they found completely changed how the myth reads. The serious academic reclamation of Medusa's story began in the 1970s. That timing is not a coincidence. The 1970s were when women entered the academy in significantly larger numbers for the first time, and when feminist scholarship began to ask different questions of ancient texts. Not just what does this myth say, but whose interests does it serve? Who constructed this story? Who transmitted it? Who benefits from this version surviving? The classicist Sarah Pomeroy published Goddesses, Whores, Wives and Slaves in 1975, one of the first serious academic treatments of women in antiquity. It established a methodological framework that would shape decades of scholarship. That myths about women in the ancient world were constructed by men, transmitted by men, preserved by men, and shaped throughout to serve male social and political interests. Reading those myths critically meant asking whose perspective was centered and whose was not. The feminist theorist Hélène Cixous wrote an essay in 1975 called The Laugh of the Medusa, which became one of the most influential works of feminist literary theory of the 20th century. Cixous argued that Medusa was not monstrous at all, that the terror she inspired was the terror of the male gaze, encountering a powerful female subject who refused to be an object. You only have to look at the Medusa straight on to see her, Cixous wrote. And she's not deadly. She's beautiful, and she's laughing. That essay was read by generations of students and scholars and writers, and eventually reached a much broader cultural audience than academic essays typically do. More recently, writers like Natalie Haynes have brought these arguments into mainstream discourse. Haynes, a classicist who has written for general audiences and done extensive broadcast work, has argued consistently that the structure of Greek mythology is designed to make you see through the hero's eyes. Perseus never questions what he is doing. The audience is never invited to question it either, because the monster has been established in advance. You come into the story already knowing how to feel. But what happens when you refuse to start from that premise? What happens when you ask, what was Medusa's experience of these events? She was a priestess who was assaulted in the space she served. She was then transformed by her own institution, the goddess she served, into something monstrous, as punishment for what was done to her. She was exiled to the margins of the world. She spent her mortal life in isolation, unable to have contact with any other being without accidentally destroying them. She was eventually killed in her sleep by a man who had been told she was a monster and given the tools to kill her, never knowing or being invited to consider the actual circumstances of her transformation. And then her face was worn as a trophy by the very goddess who condemned her. That is Medusa's story. It does not require modern interpretation to read this way. It is what the oldest, most complete sources say happened. The only thing required is the willingness to follow the thread to the end. And in the 21st century, that willingness has exploded in a way the mythology establishment did not expect. Medusa became one of the most searched mythological figures on the internet, particularly after approximately 2016. Not in the monster sense, in the survivor sense. The phrase, "she was a victim, not a villain," spread across social media in a way that surprised classicists who had been making this argument in academic papers for decades. Medusa imagery went viral repeatedly, as tattoo designs, as art, as shorthand in online communities discussing survivor experiences, institutional failure, and the phenomenon of being blamed for what was done to you. People were not learning this from mythology textbooks. They were arriving at it by reading the myth carefully, with different questions than the ones they had been given. Now here is the part of the story where I want to be honest about what is genuinely contested. Because there are serious scholars who push back on the victim-blaming interpretation of Athena's response. And their argument deserves to be engaged with directly, not dismissed, engaged. Not every classicist reads Athena's response as victim-blaming. The scholarly debate is real, and it centers on the question of how to understand Athena's motivation, given the ancient Greek religious context in which the story was originally told. The counter-argument goes something like this. In ancient Greek religion, the violation of sacred space was not merely an offense against the deity associated with that space. It was a cosmic crime, an act of impiety so serious that it disrupted the divine order itself. A temple was a boundary between the mortal world and the divine. When that boundary was violated, the space was contaminated. The goddess was dishonored in a specific institutional way. Her power and authority had been openly defied. In this reading, Athena's transformation of Medusa was not exactly punishment in the way we might understand punishment today. It was more like, and this is an uncomfortable analogy, but it is the one this argument reaches for, quarantine. The sacred space had been contaminated. The person associated with the contamination had to be removed from civilization. The transformation itself could be read as the goddess protecting others from the fallout of a situation she did not cause and could not fully resolve. Some versions of this argument go further and suggest that by transforming Medusa, Athena was actually giving her a kind of power she would not otherwise have had. The ability to turn aggressors to stone, protection against further violation, a form of terrible, permanent self-defense. These arguments are in the literature. They are made by serious scholars. They deserve to be taken seriously. But here is where they fall apart. Even if you accept every element of the institutional contamination reading of Athena's decision, even if you grant every possible charitable interpretation of her motivation, you are still left with a single, inescapable fact. Poseidon faced no consequences. None. Not symbolic consequences, not divine censure, not restricted access to temples, not a conversation with Zeus. Nothing. He violated a sacred space, committed a crime against a mortal woman who served that space, and then walked away. He continued to be the god of the sea. He continued to appear in myths. He continued to do what he did, to other people, in other places. He was never held to account by anyone for what happened in that temple. If Athena's concern was truly the integrity of the divine order, if the sacred space being violated was genuinely what she was responding to, then the person who violated it should have been the primary subject of any response. The contamination came from Poseidon's act, not from Medusa's existence. Responding to the contamination by destroying the victim while the perpetrator walked free was not restoring the divine order. It was protecting someone who was too powerful to challenge. The asymmetry is the story. However well-intentioned, however constrained by political realities, however genuinely limited by the power structure she operated within, Athena's choice produced an outcome where the powerful man faced nothing and the mortal woman was destroyed. That outcome is not ambiguous, and the story's refusal to interrogate it, its speed to move on to Perseus and his quest, tells you exactly what the tradition that transmitted it valued. So what is the actual legacy of Medusa's story? What does it mean that this particular myth has survived 3,000 years, been deployed across dozens of political contexts, been simplified and complicated and reclaimed and debated, and is right now, at this moment, more culturally alive than it has perhaps ever been? So what do we actually make of Medusa? Because, I want to be honest, this story does not end with a clean moral. The version of it that ends cleanly, monster slain, hero triumphant, divine justice served, is precisely the version that requires you to stop asking questions at the most convenient moment. If you follow the story to the end, if you read Ovid, if you engage with the scholarship, if you refuse to accept the simplified monster framing, here is what you are left with. A woman chose a life of devotion and institutional service. That institution failed to protect her from one of the most powerful figures in existence. When it could not, or would not, hold that powerful figure accountable, it redirected its response toward the person least able to resist. It destroyed her life, branded her monstrous, exiled her from civilization, and then stood by while she was eventually hunted and killed. After which it took her severed face and mounted it on its own armor as a symbol of power. And the story of all of that, the full, complicated, documented story, was simplified over centuries into a narrative in which Medusa was the villain, Perseus was the hero, and Athena was merely the divine sponsor of civilization triumphing over chaos. That simplification served specific interests for specific periods of history. The Athenians needed it. The Renaissance needed it. The Victorian era needed it. Every generation that used Medusa's image to justify the suppression of female power needed the simple version, because the complicated version asked questions that were inconvenient. Questions like, what does it mean when an institution of justice protects the powerful rather than the vulnerable? What does it mean when the narrative that survives is the one that makes the institution look righteous? What does it mean when the person who suffered the most ends up remembered as the monster? Those are not ancient questions. They are the questions that show up in every era, in every institution, in every story where someone with power does something to someone without it, and the system has to decide what to do next. The Greeks embedded them in mythology 3,000 years ago, because mythology was how they processed the most uncomfortable truths about their world. And the fact that these particular questions, in this particular myth, keep resurfacing, keep going viral, keep generating tattoos and academic papers and social media threads and documentary pitches, that is not a coincidence. Medusa's story survived because it is true in a way that transcends its setting. Not literally true. Poseidon did not literally walk into a temple. Athena did not literally transform anyone. But true in the pattern it describes. True in what it shows about power, about institutional response, about the gap between the story that is told and the story that actually happened. The classicist and author Natalie Haynes put it well when she wrote about the women of Greek mythology. These women are not peripheral. They are the story. We have just been looking in the wrong direction. What does Athena's legacy look like, honestly examined? She was the goddess of wisdom and justice. She was also the deity who condemned an innocent woman, weaponized her, and then wore her face. Both things are true. The myth does not resolve them. It does not ask you to. What it asks, if you are willing to sit with the discomfort, is this. When the most powerful figure in the room makes a choice about who bears the cost of someone else's crime, what does that choice reveal about who the institution is actually for? Medusa has been a monster for 3,000 years. Maybe the real question is, who needed her to be? Now, if you found Medusa's story disturbing, what I'm about to tell you will genuinely stop you cold, because the story of Persephone follows almost the same pattern. A young woman, a powerful god who does what he wants, a parent who not only failed to protect her, but signed off on the arrangement, and a deal that trapped her underground for eternity. A story that has been told for 3,000 years as a myth about the seasons. It is not a story about the seasons. That video is coming next, and I promise, you will not look at it the same way again. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you there.